Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I really hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and all the better for spending some quality time with you listening to a fabulous story. But don't forget to get that quintessential drink, and you know the rules. If you're drinking something really unique, I want to know about it. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I studied the pale, gaunt and somewhat anxious patient in the bed at the hospital and was heartily relieved to see that she was making steady progress, as when she first arrived in the ER, she'd lost so much blood from a lethal open gash to her femoral artery on her leg. Things looked very grim for her long-term prognosis, but it seemed that miraculously the blood transfusion and efficient surgery had brought her back from the very brink of death. In my experience, injuries like hers are almost unsurvivable, because the blood loss can be so extreme that sometimes medical intervention comes just far too late. But luckily for my patient, against all odds, she miraculously survived. When she first arrived in the ER, she looked like an insipid, waif-like raw sausage, as she was scratched up so badly with deep, long vertical lacerations and cuts that were entrenched in her skin. It looked like she'd been sliced by a very sharp razor knife, and she was covered in her own blood from top to toe. And I remember her frightened blue eyes looked at me through this iron-rich red face mask, and her faint words were begging me to help her. Please don't let me die. I don't want to die. Please don't let me die," she had whispered on the gurney before she drifted into unconsciousness. It was a bear attack, I'd been told, and I'm sorry, but I wasn't buying into that story, which I vehemently repudiated and discounted for a bear, as in my experience, bears do not attack in this way. I could see the family gathering around the young girl's hospital bed, and they looked concerned and apprehensive, whispering among themselves, and I knew in my gut that the family were being unusually secretive, and there was something that they were hiding and suppressing from the doctors. But that is not altogether unusual in my experience, as patients do often hide secrets from their doctors. "How is Elaine doing, doctor?" Mrs. Piper asked me, looking concerned. "She is going to be all right, isn't she?" "Your daughter's case is fascinating," I said to Mrs. Piper. "She is indeed very lucky to be alive. We very nearly lost her in the ER. It was a touch-and-go situation in there for a while, I'm not going to lie. I would go so far as to say it really is quite a miracle that she is alive." "But she is going to be fine, isn't she, doctor?" said Mrs. Piper. "I mean, she will make 100% full recovery, won't she?" "I am not concerned about your daughter's physical progress, Miss Piper. On the contrary, she's doing remarkably well, and I expect her to make 100% recovery. But I am very worried about her mental well-being. It seems your daughter is suffering from severe post-traumatic distress disorder. I've reports from the nurses that were working last night that your daughter was screaming and kicking during her sleep and was engaged in a terrifying nightmare, almost as if she was fighting off an attacker. The alarmed nurses had to wake her up to calm her down and give her some sedatives. I do think she's going to need to see a psychiatrist, because she is seriously traumatized from her experience, and I'm afraid it is emotional wounds that leave the longest-lasting scars." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Piper. "What are you trying to say, doctor? Are you saying my daughter is mentally unstable?" "I'm not saying anything of the sort, Mrs. Piper. You've got me completely wrong. Your daughter is mentally stable and very sound in mind, but she is deeply traumatized and disturbed." "Are you sure this was a bear attack, Mrs. Piper?" I asked her. Mrs. Piper looked as if her face had grown as white as a sheet. She was intentionally evasive and prevaricating, avoiding any kind of eye contact with me. I could see she wasn't a good liar at all. "Of course it was a bear attack, doctor," she said ambiguously. her brown frightened eyes looking guarded and non-committal. "Oh, sorry, Doctor, I completely forgot. I better get going quickly," she said, incorporating the art of distraction to try and avoid any more uncomfortable questions from me. She promptly said, oh dear, I'm running so late. I need to get back to the farmhouse at once. I've completely forgotten to feed the chickens. Oh, my word. Goodbye, sweetheart. I'll see you soon later," she said, planting a kiss on Elaine's forehead. "Come, kids. We need to get going now," she said, addressing her kids. "But we've only just got here, Mum," said her daughter Amy. "I thought we were staying with Elaine a little longer," she complained. "We're going now," snapped Mrs. Piper in a formidable voice that sounded more like a bark, and the three of them scuttled out of the hospital obediently, all too aware that their mother's onerous tone of voice could not be challenged. It seemed like my questions had ruffled her feathers. I smiled to myself. People were very funny. I'd seen it working in the hospital over and over again, and I was astute about reading body language, and evasive, indeterminate behaviour and guarded secrets were never uncommon in hospitals among my patients. Other doctors would probably just have shrugged their shoulders in a nonchalant way and said, "Well, I don't want to get involved anyway. But something stinks about this case, but who cares? I'll just turn a blind eye to it." But not me. I'm inquisitive and curious by nature and like to connect all the dots. Furthermore, I'm fascinated by things that cannot be explained. I knew without a shadow of a doubt I had to get to the bottom of this intriguing, inexplicit and enigmatic mystery, come hell or high water. So I quickly pulled the curtain around my patient's bed for some privacy and pulled up a chair to the side of Elaine's bed. "How are you feeling today, Elaine?" I asked. I'm fine, Doctor," she said, looking at me awkwardly. Thanks for saving my life, Doctor. I really mean that. I'm very, very grateful. I really thought I was going to die." "Well, it was touch and go for a minute," I said, "but you're a very lucky girl, and a big fighter at that. I think your determination to live helped a lot. The mind is a very powerful thing, you know." "I really thought I was going to die, Doctor," said Elaine again. "It was so weird, but the moment I started to bleed out, I could feel myself fading, and I knew I was slipping away. It wasn't unpleasant. It was rather like a floating feeling. But it scared me because I really didn't want to leave my body." "Well, the life is in the blood, isn't it?" I said. "So invariably when you lose too much blood, that's when people pass away. That's what usually happens if you lose too much. But you were one of our miraculous cases, I'm very happy to have to say. Now, Elaine, I'd like you to be truthful with me for a moment. I assure you that I will keep what you tell me in the strictest of confidence, but I happen to know that you were certainly not attacked by a bear." "How do you know, Doctor?" stammered Elaine, looking fretful and anguished. "My mother didn't tell you, did she? Because she doesn't want anybody to know what happened to me. She's petrified of anyone learning the truth." "I know you weren't attacked by a bear, Elaine, because in my experience a bear tends to knock people over with its paws. It tends to bite the upper arm and leg, and often snaps the neck. But you were not attacked like that. Some of your wounds are remarkably like a sharp knife that has been deliberately pierced through your skin in long vertical cuts, like someone deliberately using a cutting instrument." "Doctor, I can't tell you what happened. My family, they told me to say that it was a bear. I can't break that promise to them." "Why? I don't understand," I asked. "Whom are you trying to protect? Is someone in your family deliberately hurting you?" Elaine's eyes grew round like saucers. "Doctor, we're just trying to protect our own sanity. If anyone was to hear our story, they would definitely think it was fictitious. They would never, ever believe us. They would think we were as nutty as fruitcakes and that we belonged in the funny farm. We don't want people to think we're completely loopy, Doctor." "That's a bit extreme," I said. "Why don't you tell me what really happened? And I won't judge you, however bizarre your story is. Believe me, I've seen some things in my time that would most certainly make your hair curl. Working as a doctor, sometimes with dying patients, I have experienced paranormal phenomena, so I'm very open to your story, however peculiar and incongruous it may sound. Besides, you have clearly been very traumatized, and in my experience, it rarely helps to talk about what happened. Doctor, I'm scared to tell you, said Elaine. I'm frightened you won't believe me, she said, tears pouring down her face. It was big. It was horrible. It was grotesque, monstrous, and the most hideously ugly thing that I've ever seen. Well, why don't you start from the very beginning? It's my lunch break now, so I have plenty of time on my hands to listen, and I'm a great listener, I assure you. I watched Elaine as she composed herself. Well, we recently moved to the countryside in Washington. We used to live in Seattle, but Dad decided we should move to a place outside Shelton, very close to Toano State Park, which I think is about an hour-and-a-half drive from Seattle. You see, my father only has to be in his office twice a week, so it's not that too far for him to commute. It's situated close to the shoreline of the Hood Canal, and is a very warm saltwater beach. Yes, I think I am actually rather familiar with Toano State National Park. I seem to remember I went camping there once when I was a young girl, and lots of fun we had there too, I might add. I think we'd go down to the beach when the tide was in. We'd swim and picnic and sunbathe. It was glorious. Those were the days. Good, so you know the area then. Well, we bought a beautiful property on 50 acres of rolling, verdant green countryside, and about 6 months ago, after all the renovations to our home were complete, we finally moved in. My mother has an architect's degree and had in mind to build a very unique rustic-style Italian farmhouse there in the countryside, built out of natural stone with a large black-tiled roof, archways and high ceilings, and very big, spacious windows. It was stunningly beautiful, a very natural result, and looked like something that you'd expect to see in the Tuscan countryside, as it's quaint and charming. So my mother's masterful designs were very brilliant. My 2 sisters and I were very excited about the move, namely because of all the space and the exquisite panoramic views there, because believe me, where we live now is so beguiling. I would wake up in the morning and actually pinch myself and say, "Do you really live in such a paradise?" I couldn't believe it. You see, we've been raised in a very small apartment in Seattle where you could barely swing a cat. Pardon the pun. The majority of the land on our property is densely wooded, with a mixture of statuesque, rather majestic hardwood and pine trees, and it has so many ATV and walking trails on the property, and is teeming with birds, waterfowl and wildlife, and we have a fabulous silvery lake on the edge of the wood green, surrounded by weeping willows and well stocked with fish. I've even seen bald eagles around there a lot, and I've collected some of their feathers. Oh my word, those birds, they're absolutely phenomenal. I've never seen anything like them. They just beguile me so much. Well, every day when we were free from the demands of our homework, my sisters and I would take our ATVs out and ramble around the countryside down some of those ATV paths, because it's so fun just getting out into the country, listening to the fabulous bird song and encountering a deer or a fox or something like that. It's so peaceful and so uplifting. Well, of course it is, I said. I heartily agree. In my experience, Mother Nature is a miraculous healer. If I have a depressed patient, I'll often suggest they take some long walks in the countryside. And guess what? When they come back, they're almost completely cured. Well, I can believe that, said Elaine reflectively. I think nowadays we deprive ourselves of going out as much as we should, and people get cabin fever without even knowing it, and wonder why they're feeling down. Anyway, back to my story. It was a few days ago, before my accident, my sisters and I were driving our ATVs down these mountainous trails, when suddenly we smelt the foulest, most disgusting smell that we have ever discerned before. It was so vile that I had to park my ATV at the side of the trail and throw up the entire contents of my stomach into the thick bushes. I was seriously sick. Believe me, I hurled up everything. It wasn't pleasant. My sisters were grievously concerned about me and asked me if I was all right, because I was shaking so much. The smell was so discomposing, rather like a decaying corpse with sulphurous undertones. It was absolutely revolting. All of a sudden, I remember I had this ominous feeling that we were being watched by unseen eyes. I don't know how to describe it to you, but it felt very much as if something was just staring at us. I don't know why, but I looked up, and that was when I saw the 7-foot bipedal creature standing on a tree branch, and he balanced on it with such poise and grace. He was looking down at us with the meanest, most malevolent and hateful eyes that I have ever seen. But I could tell he was intelligent. I think all three of us had seen the creature as our ATVs had just stopped, and we were all looking up at the very same large oak tree. I truly think we were confounded by what we were perceiving, as this was not something we even imagined could exist in modern-day America, and we had no idea what on earth it was. So despite our terror, I think we were transfixed by this startling anomaly. So what did this animal actually look like, I asked. Well, it was covered in jet black hair, and when I say black, I mean the blackest black that you can think of, which was the length of about a short-haired German shepherd dog all over its body. It had the face of a wolf, with pointed upturned ears, and it had a jaw full of pointed canine teeth that looked like deadly weapons or sharp daggers. But its body was shaped exactly like a man, only much, much bigger. And the claws on this thing were like vertical knives on the edges of this human-like hands, so I suppose those knives were like his nails. And whatever this thing was, it had a long black tail like a panther that was swishing backwards and forwards, very much like an agitated cat. It was similar to the hair standing on edge of a normal domestic cat, because this creature's tail grew much bushier by the second, and I've seen our cat Tabitha do that very same thing when she's not happy. This thing, whatever in God's name it was, appeared to be swinging the branch above his head backwards and forwards as it watched us. And then it unleashed a savage growl and snarled at us, exposing its jaw full of dagger-sharp-like teeth. It was the most terrifying thing that I've ever witnessed. And that growl, the growl that this thing made, was more vicious and unsettling and intimidating than that of a great lion. It almost physically disorientated me, as a feeling of total dread swept over me, and I instinctively sensed that this creature wanted blood, and my blood at that, for he was sniffing the air, and his focus was pinned directly on me, not my sisters, me, almost like he'd singled me out for his dinner. My sister Amy shouted, "Go, go, go! Get out of here quickly!" But I was almost immobilised by fear. I was shaking so much like a jelly that I could barely start up the engine. It was a very distressing feeling, and I could hear my sisters moving away on their ATVs very fast, but I was lagging far behind. Finally, I got my ATV started, and then I heard a loud thud, and I instinctively knew that this creature had jumped off the tree branch onto the ground, much like a domestic pussycat, as his agility was utterly extraordinary. In that moment, this thing pounced on my ATV and turned it upside down in one seamless move. I went rolling down the slight hilly elevation until my body came to a grinding stop. The next thing I knew, this thing pounced on top of me and began to lash at me with his claws, and they were so sharp. But the funny thing was, he didn't attempt to bite me at all. It was like he was using his talons to tear me apart. In that moment, I can't believe it, but I was startlingly calm, and I didn't feel any pain at all, even though he'd ripped right through my flesh with his razor-like talons, and he even licked off some of the blood on his long nails, and I could tell he loved the taste of it, because he had a very satisfied look in his eyes, almost like, "This is delicious." I could hear my sister's terrified screams, because they were eyewitnesses to this blood-curdling scene unfolding before their eyes. They said they felt this sense of helplessness, like they had to watch me being consumed by a predator. All of a sudden, I heard this huge commotion, like something monstrously huge was bolting through the thicket like a rhino on full charge. And I remember thinking, "Please God, no, not another one of these monsters." And that was when I saw a completely different creature that looked so human-like, but was colossally big. It was easily 10 foot tall and much more powerfully built than the creature that was actually attacking me. I would describe his body as hefty, burly, and Herculean in size. This incongruous humanoid hairy creature began to attack the wolf-like humanoid that had initially been attacking me. And as it lunged towards this creature, it indicated for me with its arm to go, and I saw it had the kindest brown eyes that I've ever seen. As my ATV was toppled over and was far too heavy for me to lift up, I ran towards my sister's and got onto hers, and I turned around to see that the creature that had rescued me was punching this wolf-like humanoid viciously hard and thumping his head against the ground, and was on top of this thing. But this wolf-like thing was putting up a huge fight, and we could hear growls and snarls and hisses and screams and grunts. It was terrifying. Of course, my sister rushed me into the house and called emergency services, and I was starting to bleed out very fast from the gash in my leg, which was beginning to open up. So my sister made a tourniquet. I kept hearing my mother say, "We're going to lose my baby. She's dying." Oh, that freaked me out, let me tell you. "Wow," I said, "that is some story." "Well, it's not exactly over," said Elaine. "You see, after I was in ER and I was stabilised and my parents told that I was going to live, they went back to the scene of the accident, and they found so much blood on the ground where the attack had occurred between those two creatures that my father said that one of those beings did not survive that attack based on the amount of blood he found. It goes without saying we were obviously very concerned that the kindly creature that had come to my defence and rescue had not ended up being killed by that wolf-like demonical creature. We couldn't be sure what the outcome actually was. That night my sister couldn't get any sleep. She was fretting so much because I was still in hospital. She happened to glance out of her bedroom window that overlooks the woods, as she was certain she'd heard a strange sound. My parents had left all the outside lights on in the property, so my sister saw this dark, shadowy humanoid form creeping silently towards our home, and in his overlong arms he was carrying my ATV, almost as if it was a toy car, and he put it down outside the front porch. She could see it was the creature that had come to my rescue, who she believes without a doubt is a Bigfoot, but she could see that it had been badly cut up from the fight, but it was absolutely fine, thank goodness. She said she watched it gliding into the woods, and she said this overwhelming peace came over her, knowing that the Bigfoot is out there protecting us and our family. It most certainly must have killed that wolf-like humanoid. I'm so relieved about that, let me tell you. "Wow," I said, "what an extraordinary story. And yes, I believe every single word of it. I've always believed in the existence of Bigfoot, but that other creature you encountered, well, I can't fathom what it is. But I do believe in strange cryptid-like creatures. It would be nonsensical to think that all those forests we have here in North America are not inhabited by things that we may never have actually seen." "Now it's your turn," said Elaine. "And by the way, I have lots of spare time as well, and I'm a great listener too." "What do you mean it's my turn?" I chuckled. "Well, you did say working at this hospital here, you've seen things that have made your hair curl." "Oh, that," I said. It's nothing worth talking about, really. Are you kidding? Said Elaine. It's your turn. Now, fair's fair. I told you my story. Now you need to tell me yours. Well, let's think, I said. I had a patient once who came to accident and emergency after having been shot in the chest. The prognosis didn't look good at all, but it seemed he had pulled through and was recovering well, and everybody believed he was finally on the mend. Well, I was sitting at my desk, filing some reports on all my patients, and I looked up and saw my patient sitting on the swivel chair opposite me, and I looked up in surprise and said, "What are you doing here, Johnny? You need to get back to your ward right now. You shouldn't be walking around like this in your condition. You need to recuperate." "But doctor," he protested, "I feel fantastic. In fact, I've never felt better. The pain has miraculously gone." "Well, that's because the painkillers are working well, Johnny, but you need to get back to the ward. You shouldn't be sitting up." "But, doctor," he protested, "can I not sit here with you for just a moment?" I had 2 more reports to file, so reluctantly I agreed. I wasn't very happy to have this patient of mine wandering around the hospital after a serious shooting injury. I was typing in my report of the motorcycle accident that had come in half an hour ago. Johnny looked at me and said something very peculiar. He said, "Of course, the motorcyclist is not going to make it. His grandmother, the one with the bright red hair, has been waiting for him since very early this morning. She's come to collect him." Of course, I didn't pay much attention to Johnny, as I was so focused on filing my reports and taking down all the details. I turned around and told Johnny to come with me because I wanted to take him back to the ward and make sure he obeyed my instructions. He walked alongside me. When I finally entered the ward, Johnny's bed was occupied by another patient. I said to the nurse, "Why is someone lying in Johnny's bed? This bed belongs to Johnny." She said to me, "Oh, doctor, didn't you know? Johnny died an hour ago." I told her she was wrong and turned around to address Johnny, and he had just vanished. I was so confused and overwhelmed by the experience, as Johnny had appeared to me as solid and physical as you or I, and yet he must have been a ghost. I discovered that the victim of the motorbike accident had indeed died, and I remembered Johnny's ominous words. I went to inform his parents that he'd been tragically killed, and we could do nothing to save his life. Of course, the parents were completely devastated, but the mother said to me, "I hope he'll be with his grandmother now." I said, "Is that the one with the bright red hair?" She looked at me in astonishment and said, "How could you know that?" I just said, "I had a feeling." "Wow, that is a story," laughed Elaine. "You must have fascinating experiences being a doctor. I think I might become a doctor myself one day." Fast forward about 15 years, and Elaine was true to her words. She became a very good doctor, working in the hospital alongside me. So it's a very small world indeed. I'm glad to say that with a little counselling, she overcame her trauma and believes that Bigfoot saved her life. She thinks he still lives out there in her woods. So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. If anybody knows what kind of creature that Elaine was attacked by, please let us know. Until next time, goodbye and good night.